today's program, we'll be concentrating on just one topic: people-to-people exchanges between China and India since ancient times. As the two countries are currently locked in a border standoff in Donglang or Doklam, how can we improve mutual understanding and gain greater trust? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. I'm Liu Xin in Beijing. China and India are two rising countries which have nurtured great civilizations in history. The two countries share a border of more than 2,000 kilometers, but why have exchanges between the two seem more limited than others who are geographically more distant? Is there any way to improve mutual understanding? Joining me today in the discussion is Victor Gao, Global Counselor of the Asia Society, and from Shanghai, Tang Sen, Professor of History and Director at the Center for Global Asia at the New York University in Shanghai. But before we go into the discussion, let's take a look at this first.
How did ancient China and ancient India influence one another? Let's start with Indian influence on China. Their cultural relations can be traced back to very early times. The first contact records were written during the 2nd century BC. Buddhism was transmitted from India to China 3 centuries later. Generations of Chinese Buddhists have walked the Silk Road in pursuit of true wisdom. The most notable pilgrim was Xuanzang in the 7th century. Meanwhile, trade relations via the Silk Road acted as an economic conduit between the two regions. During the 15th century, Zheng He and his ships reached southwest India. What about the influence of ancient China on ancient India? The majority of the Mahayana Buddhist scriptures and many precious works from ancient India are now mostly preserved in Chinese. However, compared with Chinese influence on other Asian countries, such as tea and language, that influence is limited. Why should that be so? Between China and India lie the greatest mountain ranges in the world, ranges which were insurmountable obstructions in ancient times. Earlier research also suggests that, comparatively speaking, Chinese culture has been more ready to accept foreign influences. What about now? China and India together have a population of 2.5 billion people, around 1/3 of the world's population. Yet data suggests that in 2015 there were only 900,000 visits between the two. Sino-Indian trade volume stands at roughly $70 billion, making China India's largest trading partner and India China's 8th.
Let's go back to time first and welcome to the two gentlemen to our show. Professor Sen, let me ask you first. Statistics from historical documents indicate exchanges of the two civilizations trace back 2,000 years, as we've heard. And China has absorbed and localized Buddhism from India. Yoga is very popular in China today. However, if we look the other way around, Chinese culture seems to have had limited impact in India. Some say the exchange of the two civilizations is unbalanced. Do you agree?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, it's the problem of research being done on what went from China to India. It's not that nothing went. In fact, if we look at manufacturing of paper and gunpowder, it seems these are two important things that went from China, although perhaps not directly from China, but through other areas into India. Some people have also argued that perhaps some Taoist influences reached India. The research has mostly focused on how India has influenced China, but there has to be more research on what went from China to India. And one of the problems with doing that kind of research is the limitation of sources. Unlike in Chinese language material, there's a lot of records of what's coming from India. We hardly find that in Indian sources. That does not mean nothing went from China. It's that we have not looked at it and we have not found it. But hopefully in the near future we'll find many things.
Why has there been a limited record of Chinese influence in India, Professor Sen?
Well, in India, the sources are not very much concerned about foreign societies as such, unlike in Chinese dynastic histories or other sources. There are sections that deal with foreign people and foreign places. The kind of material that we get from India is of a different sort. So we should not expect that Indian sources would be similar to that of the Chinese. And that is the reason why we find different sets of sources. They are not very interested in foreign areas. That does not mean India did not interact with other societies, did not accept things from other places. It's just that the sources did not record as the Chinese have recorded about foreign societies and people.
Yeah, Dr. Gao, what is your take on this issue?
Well, first of all, I think there are many examples of Chinese influence on India. Tea, for example, which was originally grown in China, was introduced to India and has become a very important item of Indian export in certain parts of India. Secondly, I would say the Chinese people, historically speaking, have been very good at keeping records. As a matter of fact, you know, for some of the historical records that Chinese travelers and scholars have kept millennia ago about India now become very important historical sources for Indian scholars to study the origin and the historical background of not only historical figures but also geographical locations. And this again is a very important contribution of the Chinese culture to the Indian scholastic studies, for example, and I believe there are many other examples. But suffice it to say that for more than 2,000 years of mutual exchanges, China benefits a great deal from India by the introduction of Buddhism to China, as well as Tibetan Buddhism from India to Tibet, which also has its own influence on the rest of China, especially in the Mongolian region, for example. And on the Indian side, unfortunately, there have not been many written records about that, but I think it is important to emphasize that for about 2,000 years, China and India have been living in peace with each other, and there has been no written record about aggression by one country into the other. And I hope this will remain the mega trend going forward.
It's our common hope, I might say, as well. But however, there seems to be this misconception, let's say, according to Professor Sen, that the cultural exchanges between ancient China and ancient India has been unbalanced. It seems to have been a one-way traffic. Professor Gao, Dr. Gao, what do you think are some of the possible reasons in that perception?
First of all, I don't think such perception is warranted. For example, it is true that Buddhism started in
For
Nepal.
instance, some people are saying, look, Confucius and Sakyamuni lived relatively in the same period of time. However, you have more influence in China of Indian Buddhism instead of in India by Confucius thoughts.
Yeah, true. But on the other hand, you know, Buddhism actually started in Nepal and spread to many parts of India. When the Chinese introduced Buddhism from India, it's mostly from certain areas in the northern part of India, and the whole process took many centuries to complete. Eventually, Buddhism actually died out in India, and now I think there is a tendency that Buddhism can be reintroduced back to India, at least as a cultural example for studies, etc. That means the influence is definitely not one-way traffic, it's mutual, and both China and India have benefited from these exchanges in historical terms, but also at present. And I think the future potential for mutually beneficial exchanges between China and India remains very high, and we all need to dedicate ourselves to fully exploring these potentials.
Professor Sen, what is your take on this issue? You know, the kind of difference of influence between Buddhist thinking in China and the Confucius thinking in India. And also the former Indian leader Nehru once said it is a pity that India did not learn more practical things from Chinese.
Well, that's not true. I think there are certain things that I disagree with Victor here. I think assigning nation states to Buddhism is problematic. Nepal is the origin place of Buddhism. I think Nepal as such was not existing. So I think we fall into this kind of a nation state basic study of the ancient period where we should not be. But there are things, as I mentioned, gunpowder is actually something that went from China to India. It did not directly go from China to India. It went through other people, so it was paper making. So I think these are two important items that moved from China to India. It's just because we think it has to be India, China, and we do not consider the presence of other societies and people. We forget that things don't go directly from one place to another. It's the same as Buddhism. Buddhism went to or came to China through different people. And the success of Buddhism was the translation activity that was done here. No comparable translation activity seems to have taken place with Confucianism or Taoism. So it's not that things did not happen, they did happen. We just have to look for them. And I think before we get to tea, which happened during the colonial period, already during the 13th, 14th centuries, we find a gunpowder which was invented in China, paper making which was invented in China, reached India, South Asia through different conduits.
Well, I would, you know, we can go on and on, but I would like to come to a different point, which is also very interesting. Compared with India, for instance, China's interaction with India is limited compared to what Chinese were interacting with other countries or other peoples in the Asian continent or in Asia Pacific. For instance, in Northeast Asia, in Eastern Asia, in Southeastern Asia, China's influence is also stronger. How come that India or the subcontinent has had relatively little influence from China? Dr. Gao?
First of all, I tend to disagree with the premise of your question. I do believe that the influence from China into India is there. More scholarly work need to be done. Now, one thing actually can explain why it is not very well organized or written about in India, mainly because for many centuries in the Indian history, India is not monolithic. India is very much fragmented into hundreds of different states, etc. And there is no unifying kind of a culture, etc., binding all these Indian states and different ethnic groups of India together. Whereas in China, even though we have ups and downs of dynasties, etc., the Chinese culture, the Chinese civilization, the Chinese written language remain very constant and very continuous. And the people throughout China actually use the same culture and the language, for example. And it will be easier for China to write into a century, entry into the Chinese history and then be disseminated very broadly and very widely throughout the Chinese civilization. Whereas in India, it will be more fragmented, more difficult to get things written about and disseminated across all the different ethnic groups in India. And I think this probably is one of the reasons why the written records about Indian influence into China has been better. And this is actually very much due to the roots of the Chinese civilization, the written Chinese characters, etc. Yes.
Professor Sen, how do you look at more modern times and the kind of relationship that we have seen between China and India as nation states? They have experienced ups and downs. India was one of the first countries to recognize new China, but it was also aligning with former Soviet Union in containing China.
Yeah, I mean, you see in the 1950s, I mean, the interactions, especially the cultural interactions in various kinds of fields, literature, statistics, was amazing. I think the 50s was a period when people-to-people connections and interactions were at their height. I think 1950s is also when diasporic communities, Chinese people settled in Calcutta and Indians in China were also interacting. So 1950s is an important period where people-to-people connections should be highlighted and should be studied, and we miss that point, is that it's not many other things related to borders that's taking place in the 1950s, but 1950s marks a time when people-to-people connections really integrated. There are many writings both in Chinese and in Indian languages and English about people who are coming and visiting China in the 50s, Chinese who are going to India and writing about their visits to India. And these are again some sources, these are recent sources that have not been studied fully. But 1950s, I think, is an important period. Yeah. And then now, in the last 10 decades, 10 years, I think the people-to-people connections have increased tremendously. Yeah. There are people who are working in various places in China, and there are also Chinese now in India. So I think the people-to-people connections are in increasing
Yes.
tendency, and I think that's something very good.
Yes, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And you have been watching The Point with Mili Shin. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back right after that with more on this very important topic. Stay with us. Welcome back to a special The Point edition on China-Indian relations, and we are joined by another guest who is Zhang Yang from the Center for East Asian Studies of Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. Welcome to you. Now let's continue our discussion and come to today's world. I would like to again start with Professor Sen. Now, China has seen a remarkable increase of outbound tourists to Asian countries such as Japan, ROK, Thailand and Sri Lanka, but not India. The total number of Chinese tourists to Japan was 6.5 million in 2016, and the number of Japanese visits to China is also impressive. However, the total number of tourists exchanged between China and India is less than 1 million in the same year. Compared to the total population of the two countries, which stood at 2.5 billion, the number is really minimal. Professor Sen, how do you look at the reasons behind this?
Yeah, that's the sad aspect, unfortunately. I think there are many factors to that. I think the promotion of tourism into India has been lacking. I think the Chinese preference to go abroad to different places is quite different. And I think the same can be said of China. I think tourism in China has not been promoted. I think there's a potential of many more Indians coming to China. I think that's the lack of incentives, I think, that has been made to bring people from China to India on various kinds of tourist places. There are many places that Chinese can visit, same with Indians coming to China. I think the two governments have to work more on that, and I think the tourism agencies in the two countries should work on that as well.
Yeah, as you mentioned, let's break down the number. Now, out of the fewer than 1 million tourists between China and India last year, the Chinese visitors to India was around 210,000, whereas Indian visitors to China stood at some 740,000. Dr. Gao, why so few Chinese visited India, and why so many more Indians visited China?
Well, first of all, it's a pity that there are not many Chinese tourists going to visit India. India is an incredible country, and there are many very, very historical and culturally interesting tourist destinations. But on the other hand, I think we also need to urge our Indian friends to beef up their infrastructure, including especially the transportation connectivities, for example, and also make sure that drinking water, for example, etc., remain very safe. And this will probably increase the attractiveness of India as a destination for tourism. Right now, actually, many tourist groups going to India are very special tourist groups, high-end tourist groups, whereas the massive numbers of the lower end and middle end tourist groups are few in between from China visiting India for whatever reasons. And I think education also needs to be enhanced in China to broadcast the attractiveness of the Indian tourist destinations. I personally believe the potential for promoting tourism one way or another between China and India is really very, very huge. Now we have about 120 million Chinese tourists going abroad every year.
Yes.
If we just say 10% of that, for example, that will be many, many times of the current amount of tourists going back and forth between China and India.
Yeah, indeed. Right now the level is really too low. Let's come to Mr. Zhang. You are studying in New Delhi in India. What are your observations of the reasons behind the imbalance of personnel exchanges between the two?
I think the government has very important role on this issue. Both sides need more support from the government side, like the scholarship from China to India, they are only for exchange students, and now only around 2,000 to 3,000 Chinese students in the whole India, but only 100 in New Delhi. So most of them are self-financed. So I think also the government policy may influence the media's role. If the media show more positive things between these two sides, I think there will be more. These two countries will be more attractive for each other.
Could you be more specific, for instance, when you say if the media would show more positive things of the other country, while you're in India, what is the general impression you have of the Indian media coverage of Chinese and of China?
I think, especially in the current situation, what about the national interest of India will come to the top, like the border issue. But like the other things are not very frequently reported in India. But recently, along with the increase of investment from China to India, the Chinese Communist news also come to the Indian media. So I think it's a good trade for these two sides.
Yeah, you talk about economic and trade and investment between the two countries. Let me pick up on that, because that is also a very important part of the people-to-people exchanges between the two countries. For instance, trade volume between China and India, however, decreased from 72.3 billion to 70 billion US dollars last year, and bilateral trade between China and Japan was up to 270 billion US dollars, nearly 4 times that of the volume between China and India. Professor Sen, how do you look at the state of health of trade and economic relations between China and India?
Well, there are problems in the direct trade between India and China, but these statistics also don't count the factor that there are Indian traders based in China who are actually supplying goods elsewhere, not to India, but to the Middle East or Southeast Asia. And I think if we really want to look at the trade statistics, the presence of Indian traders here who are doing indirect business should be counted in. But that does not take us away from the fact that there are many problems in the trading relations between India and China, which relates to deficit from the Indian side. I think the industries have to talk to each other, and the government should give leeway to different industries to come in and invest in the two countries. There's a huge potential in infrastructure in India where the Chinese can invest. In the same ways, Chinese should allow Indian pharmaceutical companies to come in and trade in China. So I think there are issues that hinder the connections with regard to business and trade as well, that the two countries have to resolve.
Dr. Gao, what do you think are the possible reasons that are hindering the two countries and the two sides to sit down and resolve these differences and fully tap into the potential of economic relations?
Well, first and utmost importance is building up a higher level of mutual trust between China and India. Political relations really need to be further improved, and the border issue need to be dealt with very calmly and without letting it really disrupt the overall bilateral relations between China and India. Further, I think we also need to notice that China and Indian economies are not highly complementary towards each other, and therefore I think we need to do some more homework to identify which areas which can actually be more emphasized between China and India to make it more conducive to promote much larger items of trade between China and India. There are indeed many Indian tradesmen in China, but they are very much focused on smaller items of daily necessities, for example, produced mostly in or out of Yiwu in Zhejiang province, and they sell them back to India or other parts of the world, etc. But then in terms of big item goods to be traded back and forth between China and India, we need to think big going forward. Further, I think, in terms of the railway and highway connectivity from China's Tibet through Nepal all the way down to the Indian plains, if that can be completed with higher mutual trust, of course, then I think it will really make China-Indian trade move on to a much higher plateau, and we need to really hope for the best.
Yeah, Mr. Zhang Yang, you are in India. What is your personal observation of the kind of growing business ties between China and India? You know, how prevalent is Chinese commodities there, and how well they're received, and you know how the Indian consumers are really playing a bigger role of promoting understanding between the two countries.
I think India is very big market for China, and the potential is very big, and in Chinese product get priced by the Indian customers, and because Chinese products are very good quality with good function and less price, so it's well welcomed in India. But recently, the market will be influenced by the bilateral conflict. But it's some groups start to like hold some movement to anti-foreign product. But I think it's it's a temporary issue. It will solve with the communicate between these two sides.
Thank you very much, Zhang Yang. We have to leave it there. That was Zhang Yang from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Victor Gao in Beijing, Global Counselor of Asia Society, and Professor Tang Sen in Shanghai. And as usual, here is my last point. China and India, two ancient civilizations with a relationship dating back 2,000 years. They have been highs and lows in history, but looking into the future, we shouldn't let our relationship be described by a credit crisis. China and India have a lot of common interests despite our differences, and there is ample room for both countries to grow side by side as partners. That's all from this edition of The Point with Nili Xin. As always, you can follow us on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching, and you've got the point.